Hello everyone, Kwe Kakina, bonjour. The purpose of this video is for Angus and I to introduce you to a theory that is close to our hearts, complexity theory or complexity science, as well as how it can be used in education. Well, we're also going to talk today about some of the related influences like systems thinking and ecology. And this may sound challenging, but they are very practical perspectives that ground teaching in 21st century realities. And our job here is to explain them to you as clearly and as concretely as possible. Angus, can you tell us how you got into complexity?
Definitely, I can give a little personal background on that. I have been an idea nerd for quite some time. As a university student, I was bothered by scientific approaches that assumed they could get final and objective truth about the world, even though the theories and paradigms seem to change every 20 years. And they also assumed that everything could be explained through mechanical cause and effect reasoning. In fact, I remember having a debate with a philosophy grad student whose supervisor thought that human moral choices, like ethical choices, could be reduced to propositions within a computer program and mechanically answered. Not surprisingly, the morality computer amounted to nothing. At the same time, I was bugged by social science approaches that confidently asserted that everything was just a social construction, that issues like bodily health, learning exceptionalities, and so on were only a matter of individual experience, cultural norms, and power relations, as if our physical, biological, and ecological history had no influence. Here's another good anecdote. One of my relatives during his graduate studies thought that cold was just a state of mind. He was in philosophy. And that he could walk barefoot in the Canadian winter. Needless to say, he quickly had to rethink that one after he got a bad case of frostbite. So I was disillusioned with both the so-called objective and subjective explanations that I was given in university.
But what made you interested in complexity theory specifically?
After 7 years in university, I was working in the educational software field, but I missed school, seriously. So I signed up for a part-time Masters of Education course and started to learn about complexity science with a Canadian educator, Brent Davis, who was then starting to be recognized as an international leader in that area. The new approaches I'm describing here can also be seen in the fourth moment of a book he co-authored in 2015 called Engaging Minds, third edition. I think there's a new edition now, but it may be the fifth moment in the new edition. Anyway, for me, complexity science and related approaches like systems thinking and ecology offered a way to get over the old dichotomies and take a more intelligent and realistic approach to life, education, and specific issues like what is learning and how can we support it? How can we understand complex health issues like diabetes and obesity? How can we organize classes in a way that nurtures individual diversity yet at the same time creates a learning-focused classroom collective? Okay, Rachel, I've been talking about myself for far too long now. I know you use complexity in your PhD research as well. But before getting to that, could you explain what complexity science is all about?
One good way to explain it is to contrast it with traditional approaches that came before. Scientists in the last 500 years have had a lot of success with mechanical reductive approaches. For example, you can understand a clock well by taking it apart to its components. And you can precisely measure and predict what a billiard ball will do if you hit it with another billiard ball. And these are examples of simple systems. And educators have tried to apply this sort of thinking to teaching. For example, factory-like classrooms, inflexible learning objectives, standardized tests, behaviorist training, and the results have generally been poor. The reason is this sort of mechanical, simple system approach doesn't work very well with living systems. For example, you can't understand or predict my behavior by chopping me up into my component parts. And by taking this approach, you would destroy the very complex system that you're trying to understand. And as parents like you, Angus, know, we can't exactly predict or control what a child is going to do based on our input, no matter how hard you may try. Scientists across disciplines, therefore, have begun to develop new ideas and tools for understanding and dealing with complex living systems, whether they be organisms, human brains, social groups, cities, ecosystems.
Can I jump in here? I think it's a good time to introduce a few key complexity concepts.
Sure, be my guest.
Well, one key idea is emergence. Complex systems emerge from the interaction of their component parts, the way I emerge from my component organs, or the way social norms and changes emerge from the interaction of individuals. But unlike simple systems, complex systems are more than the sum of their parts, because something new emerges at the level of the whole system. For example, my choices and actions or new social trends. Again, these cannot be understood or predicted just by adding up the component parts.
An example of emergence that really resonates with me is music, because a song emerges from the interaction of the notes, rhythm, dynamics, melody, and harmony.
Yes, you're right. We can't fully appreciate the wholeness of a song just by reducing it to its individual notes. Two other new conceptual tools within complexity thinking are self-organization and adaptation. Complex systems adapt to their experiences and contexts the way species adapt to their environments. Unlike machines, which require an outside designer to redesign or fix them, complex systems adapt themselves in a self-organized way. Examples include the way you have adapted your thinking based on your experiences and education. Other examples of self-organization and adaptation are the way our immune system reorganizes its activities to adapt to new germs in our environment, or the way our brain and nervous system change themselves based on our experiences, for example, learning tennis or music. At a more collective level, you can see it in the way companies reorganize their activities based on supply and demand conditions in the marketplace. Another way that I'm interested in is the way that sports teams have to adapt to new strategies and playing styles. For example, the Golden Warriors three-point shooting system in basketball forced other teams to adapt. It changed the game. And Barcelona's possession and passing approach to soccer did so as well, or the increased speed of hockey. They all forced teams and groups to adapt intelligently to that new way of doing things. And finally, the way classroom interactions and culture change when a new teacher arrives and employs active learning, cooperative groups, and so on. You can see the classroom as a whole adapting in a self-organized manner to that. Finally, this sort of adaptive self-organization can be seen as learning. In fact, Jean Piaget, the godfather of constructivism, used exactly these terms, adaptation and self-organization, to ground his theory of learning. So the last thing I want to emphasize is that we should see learning in this complex biological way. That is, as adaptive reorganization of our beliefs, our schemas, our neurons, our social interactions, rather than as taking in knowledge into our heads as if they were containers or being behaviorally trained like input-output machines. This reframing of education has big consequences. And that is something we will explore further in this course. Now, let's get into another crucial concept, nestedness. Ecological nestedness, which means recognizing how everything is ecologically connected. Rachel, I know this plays a very big part in your thesis research. Can you tell us about it and how you use this concept?
Yes, like you said, to understand and deal with complex systems, we need to take a more ecological, multi-level sort of approach. Let me illustrate this a little more concretely and practically. Take, for example, the growth of obesity or diabetes in our society, which are both major problems. It's difficult to blame just one cause, like junk food, and that's because a lot of different factors come into play, like genetic predisposition, personal experiences, dietary choices, family and peer culture, physical activity at schools, city planning that favors car travel rather than bicycling and walking, even ecological factors like the lack of diversity in our gut bacteria and antibiotics in the drinking water. And all of these factors or levels, from cellular to society, likely play in the role of the growth of diabetes and obesity.
And this applies to learning and knowing too. For example, my belief that gender should be equal can be seen as shaped by my personal experiences, everything from regressive high school locker room talks to progressive discussions I have with my women friends. and the beliefs of my friends and family members, my previous education, portrayals of gender and gender discrimination in the media, and even the fact that I live in the 21st century society where feminist ideas are more accessible to me. In addition, my belief is likely limited by the fact that I am embodied as a male, and I have not experienced gender discrimination in the same sort of way that women really have. And this is not to say that such factors entirely determine what I believe. How complex systems like people respond to all these influences is never entirely predictable or controllable. For example, two different people can respond to the same factors in two different ways. But all of these levels are relevant to my beliefs, and my beliefs can be seen as self-organized adaptation in response to all these ecological influences around me. That is how I have learned through these influences.
Yes, Angus, I know you're very woke. But let's give an example of this ecological nested systems approach. And I'll use an example from my own research. So as a bit of background, in my research, I'm looking at how rural primary care providers, including physicians and nurse practitioners, learn from electronic consultations or e-consults. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with e-consults, they're a type of asynchronous telemedicine that allows a referrer, who's usually a primary care provider, to submit a patient-specific question through a secure portal, which is then responded to by a specialist consultant. Often the specialist is a physician, but it can also be someone from a different profession, such as a pharmacist. And there's a lot of different factors that influence e-consults and how primary care providers might learn from these exchanges with specialists. There's, of course, the relationship between the PCP and the specialist, but there's also other factors like the influence of technology, professional communities, and culture. And in the case of rural providers, which is what I study, geographical remoteness and even extreme weather have a role to play. And I knew I wanted to consider all these various factors in my study, but I wasn't sure how I was going to deal with so much complexity. And fortunately, Angus, who was one of my supervisors, introduced me to complexity science.
I'm always happy to have a student who shares my interest in complexity science, especially a brilliant one like you. We ultimately decided to use a nested system diagram for your conceptual framework.
Yes, and I found it to be a very useful framework for approaching both my research and my teaching, actually. So nested systems diagrams consist of a series of concentric circles, with each circle representing a different level or a system. And these different levels, which are complex learners themselves, are in dynamic interaction with one another as learners are enmeshed into many different systems. For example, you as an individual influence the social groups that you're nested within, and these social groups can also shape your experiences and your beliefs. From a complexity science standpoint, we want to draw upon theories that best explore a phenomenon within that system or level. That's not to say that different levels or learning systems are always so clearly defined, though.
Yes, things are certainly more complex in real life, and there can be some overlap between the different learning systems. All models of reality simplify things, and this is no exception. But I do think it is a useful simplification, since it highlights the multiple interacting levels that influence our life and practices.
And I adapted this model through my thesis, with complexity science kind of providing an overall epistemological umbrella for justifying and mixing so many different theories. And my framework contains 6 levels: bodily and subsystems, which refers to phenomena occurring within the body, including the body as a whole and the subsystems comprising it; individual, which refers to an individual person's learning and knowing; interpersonal, which explores social practices and interpersonal interactions, both in how they shape individual learning and how these practices and interactions themselves can be understood as learning; communities, which goes beyond interpersonal interactions to look at larger collectives like professional norms and practices; electronic infrastructure and other physical affordances, which considers the non-human world like technology; and ecosystems and the physical environment, which refers to communities of living organisms and their dynamic interactions with materials and forces of their environment. And each of these levels contains at least one theory or discourse that I can draw upon to explore a phenomenon that arises from the different systems within my nested systems diagram. For example, at the interpersonal level, I may draw upon social constructivism to explore how primary care providers internalize the knowledge that arises from their exchanges with the specialist. Or at the community level, I may draw upon community of practice to explore the broader communities that these primary care providers are engaging in. So I think we can apply the same sort of mindset to our teaching by asking ourselves, what learning system am I teaching? I find this helpful in selecting learning theories when I'm designing my courses. For example, if you want to address individual beliefs about interprofessional education, you may draw upon constructivism. However, if you are delivering an interprofessional workshop on safety culture in the emergency room, you may be more concerned with things like collective norms and practices. So a learning theory at the community level, like community of practice, might be more appropriate.
And this is something that we can discuss further in Module 5 when we discuss teaching and assessment for IPE. Also, if anyone is interested in learning more about this conceptual framework and how it applies to learning, from e-consults, we just published a paper on that in Medical Science Educator with Rachel Grant as first author. I believe I'm second. Anyway, look it up if you're interested. And I can give you lots of other articles too if you wish.
Yes, and I'll provide a link to it if anyone is interested. And I'm more than happy to answer any questions that learners may have. What we haven't revealed yet is that you, Angus, also used a nested systems diagram in your PhD.
Actually, I did. I used a nested systems diagram to create a framework for understanding and integrating disciplinary knowledge contributions in interprofessional healthcare teams, like how people from different professions could see each other's contributions as complementary rather than conflicting. I'll talk about it in our video for Module 4 since it's well aligned with our discussion about barriers in interprofessional education.
Spoiler for our next module. But I think that's a good thing to end things for our discussion. Please let us know if you have any questions, and we will pick up these ideas again in Module 4.